Let me begin by posing two questions, if I can. First of all, can a water molecule act as a resonator of information? And, second question, why, despite all the advances in modern medicine, do we still get some patients who never respond to treatment? Well, I can't answer either of these questions, but our next speaker can. Dr. A.J. Scott-Morley. He's traveled to us from the United Kingdom, where he is president of the Institute of Bioenergetic Medicine. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. A.J. Scott-Morley.
Is this one working as well? Yes, fine, great. Well, first of all, I thank you all for being here. It's the end of a long, exciting, tiring day for most. And unless I'm mistaken, most of us have got empty stomachs and there's a dinner going on afterwards for some. So let's not make it too heavy. Now, it's quite curious that I find myself standing here because this wasn't in any way planned. I'd booked a quiet little ticket to sit down there and listen to what all of these great guys have got to say and teach us. And then, unfortunately, at the last minute, Dr. Pop was unable to attend this meeting, and I was very disappointed, and I'm sure you are. And I do not stand in for Dr. Pop. That guy has got brains enough for 10 of us, and I haven't, so I'll leave you with that one. But it's kind of amusing to me to find myself standing here presenting some of my own ideas. And I don't intend to make this heavy. I don't intend to go into a lot of deep theoretical work, because the truth is I don't have answers. I don't have any answers. I have a lot of questions. Now, perhaps first of all a little background about myself. I'm not a scientist, not in the sense of white coats and laboratories and assistants and a lot of fancy equipment. I'm a practitioner. I'm faced every morning, as I'm sure many of you are, with the Mrs. Smiths and Mrs. Joneses of the world, who despite everything we do, they just point blank refuse to get better. They won't respond to what we have to offer. I'm a practitioner in the sense that I run a practice. I treat patients who care or are wise or unwise enough to trust themselves to my care. Now, what does that mean? It means I practice on my patients. I wonder how many of you do. I'll conduct various examinations. I'll listen to their presenting symptoms. I'll proceed to administer the type of treatment which I think would be most appropriate. And if that doesn't work, then I'll think of something else. And eventually, either the patient gets better or they fail to show up anymore. That's the truth of the matter. So, in a sense, from the observations I make, I'm going to term myself an amateur. An amateur in the sense that I love what I'm doing, but I don't claim to have all the answers there. Secondly, I observe the patient and I wonder. I ask myself, does the treatment that I give really have any effect? And if it does, why does it? And just now and then I'll conduct some experiments to try and answer those questions. Finally, I'd perhaps term myself a model maker. When I was a little boy, I used to make plastic models of little boats and aeroplanes. Now I make the models up here. I think the plastic ones were perhaps better. What I do is I try to put together my observations and try to make some conceptual model which makes sense to me. Now, I'd like you to sit back for a minute, take it easy, don't write anything down, just go into yourselves. See a patient if you're a doctor. See a problem that you have. and just contact your inner self and ask, do you have the resources within you to handle that problem? And listen to the answer you get. I'm sure we've all got the resources. The biggest problem that we find is we don't believe we've got those resources, and we're looking for something better all the time. Sorry, we're looking for something better all the time. I suggest we believe each other. And while you're just talking to your inner self, I mean, I'm quite happy if you sit there talking to that inner person, because it's far more valuable. Don't listen to me for the next hour. Go and communicate with that inside person. And when you're fed up of talking to that inside person, let that inside person talk to the guy or woman who's sitting next to you, and have a good message between you. You'll get far more fun out of that than any words of wisdom that I may have. So, number one question is, how do we make sense of the world around us? What do? We take in data. How do we take in the data? We take it in through our primary senses. We look. These things. We listen. Maybe if we're adventurous, we touch. We might even smell, and occasionally we'll taste. Those are the senses that we have. Those are the senses we use. Then when we've got that data, we set this thing to work on it, and we start screwing it up. What we do, we take in the data through our primary senses, and then we internalize the data. We impose some sort of subjective structure on it. And let's be clear about this. The real world, the world out there, consists of everything outside of our psyche. We take the signals from that world, we take in the information from that world, and through our senses, and only ultimately through our senses, we try to impose some order and structure onto it. We compare, we go back into the data banks. We say to ourselves, does this make sense? Now, this may be at a subconscious level, and it's extremely fast. But we ask ourselves, does this make sense? Just as you're sitting there, right at this moment, and subconsciously saying, hey, has this guy got something to say to us, or can I turn off and go to sleep now? You're going to compare in your internal memory banks. We then manipulate the data until it makes some sort of sense to us. But, and I quote at this point, and I quote Weihinger, The Philosophy of Self, where the logical function intervenes, it alters what is given and causes it to depart from reality. The organized activity of the logical function draws into itself all the sensations, and it constructs an inner world of its own, which progressively departs from reality, but still retains so intimate a connection with it that the transitions from one to the other continually take place, and we hardly notice that we ourselves are acting on a double stage. An inner world, that's us, and an external world, which we don't really understand. Now, there's an irreducible difference between the world and our experience of it. We do not act directly on the world. We create models of that world, and we guide our actions, and we do as we do in order to explain to ourselves subjectively what that world is in some sort of meaningful way. And since no two of us have exactly the same experiences, we don't have that same sum totality of experience, our own internal model has to be individual to ourselves. In other words, each single one of us live in our own internal world of reality, and just now and then it overlaps with somebody else, and we think we have something we can share with them. Now, I make this point, perhaps at some length, about our internalization of knowledge, because we are here today at a very high-powered conference. We are sharing our experience and our observations. We'll go away excited, I hope. We'll go away impressed, I hope, with important and impressive scientific research and data, and we'll think we understand something. And that's the danger. The actual truth is otherwise. We won't go away having understood anything more. We'll go away and we'll modify our own subjective model of understanding in such a way that it satisfies us as an individual. You'll listen to some speakers and you'll say, I don't buy what he says. It doesn't mesh with your inner world. And there's somebody else who'll say something and you'll say to yourself, great, that's it. I'm excited about that. Because it's overlapped with some inner perception of your own. Now, if our models should at some point have the good fortune to overlap with each other, at least in some small part, then we've got security. Now, if I conjure up an idea that's meaningful to me, but to no one else, the men come with the ambulance and they put a little white coat on me and they take me off and we say, he's mad. If I can share it with a number of people and they happen to agree with me in some part, we've got a shared reality, and then we accept that as being nearer to truth. Stop and examine that thought. Now, the scientific model, or to be more accurate, I should perhaps say scientific method, has dominated our thinking this century. We pride ourselves in greater understanding. We pride ourselves on technological achievement. Yet the truth is that although we can manipulate our environment more and more, we still do not understand nature, and we're far from understanding nature. We delude ourselves into thinking that we understand. Yet the facts stare us in the face. We observe things. Our climate of the world is changing. We've got very serious consequences arising from these climatic changes. But we still don't know what those consequences are. Anyone here who's a doctor and who's honest with themselves has to admit we're helpless. We are unable to conquer so much of chronic disease. We have new diseases, some of them very serious, such as AIDS, arising apparently from nowhere, leaving us with a feeling of impotence. And yet you, the doctor, are faced with so many patients who you appear to be unable to help. And I ask the question, if we're so clever, why is this so? Why are we so helpless? Now, in making this criticism, I'm not denying the importance nor the necessity of science. It's very important. We need a model. We need a model to explain in order to help us understand. But I also ask and plead that we all be aware of the danger of delusion. We are here today in order to establish some scientific credibility for some newer methods of medical diagnosis and treatment. Now, the first thing is, while these methods may appear to be comparatively new, most of them go back many, many years, sometimes thousands of years. Those of us that are practitioners, we have a sincere belief in their worth and their efficacy. To such an event, we are trying to find out why they work, how they work. And I'm the same in that sense. I want to see good scientific models which not only explain to me what I'm doing, but also to enable me to refine my methods and make them more effective and efficient. And yet, even as I say that, I suspect that's also a delusion. We have to retain the thought with us that medicine is still as much of an art as it is a science. The hard reality is that I'm not able to help everyone that I see, not at least in terms of curing their illness. Despite everything, some people refuse to get better. Old diseases remain intractable, and I feel helpless. And in those situations, all the theory in the world doesn't help. If your Mrs. Smith doesn't get better from her arthritis or her depression, if the treatment that we administer has little or no effect, if the drugs that we give or the surgical procedure that we adopt, even though it's been shown to be effective in most cases, if it doesn't work in this case, we're missing something out. Our model is incomplete. And it's to this end I've tried to pose some questions and to present some very, very simple models of what may be going on. Now, if time permits, I want to go through two simple models. If time doesn't, tough luck on us both, or relief. Let's get as far as we can. The first question I ask myself is, with these people who don't become well, what am I doing wrong? And I'd ask you to ask yourself the question. Picture in your mind a patient who you're failing with. You've done a lot of good work for that person. What are they telling you? What is their body telling you? No matter how good you think the work is, it's not right for them. And you're missing something out. And that says, go back to the drawing board and start again. Do we do that? Or do we persist in doing what we want to do rather than what the patient is asking us to do? Do we any longer listen to the patient? Or do we want to push our theories onto the patient? I've got a belief deep down that we've got all these wonderful tools outside. I've got many of them at home, and I've got this real belief deep down I could switch all the switches off, cut the power off, and start working with that. And just now and then I ask the patient, what do you think is the matter with you? And they tell me. The only problem is I'm stuffed up with wax too often and I don't hear. I'm too busy with my papers in front of me and says, it's got to be this, and this is what I'm going to do, by hell, whether they want it or not. Do we all do the same? However, that's not quite scientific enough, so let's look at some factors that affect health. Now, what I've tried to do is group together the broad factors which affect the health and well-being of the individual. And first of all, I'd say there is a spiritual endowment. Now, the big problem here is I can't work on the spirit because I can't even tell you what it is. I think I know. I've got a kind of gut feeling, but I don't know what the spirit is. But I get that intuitive feeling it's important. But I have to put that one on one side. I can't manipulate that directly. But I don't think we should ignore it. We can perhaps work with it indirectly. The next thing we get is the individual constitution, the genetic factors. Now, short of genetic engineering, I can't work with those factors either, except indirectly. But the other factors which then come on, I can work with. There's geopathic stress. There are the chronic foci and disturbance fields, of which we've already heard a little. There are the allergic burdens and the toxicity in the body. There are the imbalances of energy in the acupuncture meridians. There are the mental and emotional factors. And there are the effects of trauma from the past. Now, perhaps we should stop for a moment to consider each of those factors. The spiritual factor is a philosophical concept. The idea of spirit, or a spiritual basis of man, residing above and beyond the mental and emotional levels, is accepted by many. Those of us who accept the doctrine of reincarnation, we speak of karma, indicating a spiritual inheritance that we bring with us from a previous existence. However we conceive of the spirit, we do not have any agreed means by which we can measure or assess it, and we live in an age which wants to measure something. If we can't measure it, or hit it, or weigh it, it doesn't exist. We don't have the therapeutic means by which to affect it. Various religious practices claim to enhance spiritual development, but I suspect this appears to be largely a process of self-growth and self-development. So we have to put spirit on one side but not ignore it. Our constitution, we inherit much of it. We have our genetic strengths and we have our genetic weaknesses. Short of genetic engineering, the practitioner is not easily able to affect the basic genetic pattern by direct means. We have to work indirectly, perhaps through homeopathy or through acupuncture. But if we work sufficiently well on the other basic factors, then it's possible that we may succeed in strengthening the genetic picture. But it's doubtful if we can totally rectify inherited characteristics. So I term these two factors exclusive factors. I exclude them from what I can work directly with. We then come to the geopathic disturbance. Now, the term geopathic, when we use it precisely, refers to those variations in the electromagnetic field of the Earth which may cause adverse reactions on living organisms. Variations in electromagnetic background are associated, for example, with the presence of underground water, the presence of underground caves or hollows in the rock structures, certain types of mineral deposits, geological faults, grid stresses, radiation backgrounds, and Schumann wave variations. It's known that the level of magnetic activity on the Earth is not constant, but varies in intensity from place to place. And these variations, which may be very localized, may be as little as 10 inches by 10 inches, can adversely affect living organisms if that organism is constantly exposed to such a stress. These stresses, the geopathic stresses, appear to affect the total body regulation, possibly via the hypothalamus, and in addition, they may also place regulatory stresses on specific organs. Similar in many ways are the various man-made electrical disturbances, ranging from the domestic electrical supply cables through to the total electromagnetic radio soup, the stuff out there which affects our environment and which is polluting it. These variations, the geopathic and the electromagnetic stresses, often take priority in the hierarchy of health factors because they can cause an overall systemic dysfunction of the body regulation mechanism, the fundamental mechanisms. And unless a geopathic stress is properly resolved, all attempts at healing will be, at best, successful only to a limited degree, and in some cases will be totally unsuccessful. Furthermore, a geopathic problem will exacerbate. It won't cause, but it will exacerbate the effects of a focus. It will exacerbate the effects of toxic damage, faulty nutrition, metabolism, and so forth. The geopathic stresses will lead to energy imbalances in the meridian systems and may also cause emotional variations. And one of the problems that I see is that the various effects of the geopathic disturbance will so frequently be mistaken for an emotional or mental stress. The patient will come in and describe, I'm not sleeping too well, I fidget in bed, I'm getting sweats at night, I'm getting nighttime aggravation, I wake up and I have difficulty in getting going, I get depressive moods, I get mood changes, and so what do? We reach out for the prescription pad and say, here, take some Valium. Stop and think again. Then we get the chronic inflammatory foci. Now, these are localized variations in tissue which not only cause a breakdown of the local defensive barrier, but they are also associated with disturbances at a site distal from the focus. Any organ in the body may become the site of a focus, any organ, but the most common ones occur in the teeth, and by teeth I don't mean these white shiny things that we flash at everyone when we want them to like us, but I mean the bone structure and the gingival structure as well. The paranasal sinuses are very common. The tonsils, the 5 tonsillar pairs of Waldeyer's tonsillar ring are common. The appendix, the gallbladder, the ovaries and the prostate, and scar tissue. These are the most common sites of focal damage. They are often associated with toxic deposits, for example, where an infection is present, but not exclusively so. We may get low-level infection in a focus, but a scar does not have infection. We heard about this from Dr. Beck earlier this afternoon. And for this reason, and because of the distal effects, they're considered, or in my classification, they're considered as a class of their own. The main problem is that the focus may be asymptomatic. It's not suspected by the patient or by the doctor. But it's acting as a toxic reservoir and has various other effects. And so, in that sense, it's an independent factor, and it's one which we have to consider. We now move to allergies. Now, in my own view, and I make clear this is my own view, allergies should be considered as a subset of the class toxins. For practical purposes, however, it's useful to treat allergies as a separate factor, since successful total treatment will often depend on resolving any allergic reactions that may be present in the patient. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm not going to distinguish between an allergy and a sensitivity. They both create weaknesses in the autoimmune system, the neuroendocrine system, and they very often both have effects on the pituitary gland. So as far as the patient's concerned, they may be one and the same. It's from a theoretical and technical point of view we may find differences. Now, I see allergies as a complicating factor because they are rarely, in my own view and my own experience over 10 years, they're very rarely the causative factor. The body has already become weakened before the allergic symptoms evolve. Very often the lymphatic system is overtoxic and under stress, and in turn this is often traceable back to the presence of an active toxic focus. Whilst the identification of the specific allergens together with desensitization treatment is a necessary part of treatment, and it may give the patient great relief from his presenting symptom, unless we get to the underlying cause, such as the focus, and treat that cause properly, then the allergies tend to return. I wonder how many of you out there have tested patients for allergies. You said you're allergic to this, and this, don't eat these foods, and they come back a month later and they've been very good, they haven't touched those things, and you find they're no longer allergic to those foods, but they've developed a whole bunch of new ones to replace them. We can't say we're treating the cause of the illness if we're just playing with symptom removal. Toxins include any physical substance which is harmful to the normal functioning of the body. They include the exogenous toxins, the endogenous toxins, and the autotoxins. Thus, chemical toxins, bacterial and viral products, faulty cell fermentation products may all be considered as toxic produce. And I find it interesting to observe that much of conventional medicine, not all of conventional medicine, but much of it, is concerned mainly with this one single area. We're not looking at the other areas. However, the macro and micro levels of toxins can and do impede the proper functioning of the body. These may be observed as localized inflammations, faulty enzyme and hormonal reactions, poor cellular respiration, neural dysfunction, faulty autonomic nervous steering of the organs, meridian and energy imbalance, and emotional dysfunction. And since the toxic damage may cause these subsequent problems, but rarely vice versa, I would say they're independent factors. Then we come to nutrition, food and water, the energy for our body. It ranges from the correct balance of carbohydrates, proteins and fats, right through the vitamins and trace elements, to the subtle effects of sunlight on the plant, and even, in my own view, to the nature of the cooking process. Artificial additives to foods, either in the growing stage or in the preparation stage, should be considered as potential toxins. But we also need to consider the total nutritional balance. We need to take into account the role of water when considering nutrition. And that's something, if there's time, I shall move on to. The meridian energy, the acupuncture meridians, appears to be an important information pathway in the body, or pathways. Meridian energy imbalance can, in and of itself, create health problems. But again, my own observation is very often that the meridian imbalances arise because of previously mentioned factors. Acupuncture, when used as a sole modality of treatment, can help to improve health by improving the energy flow and the balance and helping to restore the homeostatic equilibrium. It seems to me there will be many instances where such treatment is not sufficient by itself unless we find the cause of that meridian imbalance. And the acupuncture practitioner himself will often speak of blocks and resort to other modalities in order to remove these blocks. Then we come to the mental and emotional factors. These include all mental and emotional stresses, whether they be conscious or subconscious. With some patients, the mental and emotional factors may predominate, suggesting a psychotherapeutic approach, whilst with others, there may be some other factor predisposing towards the mental imbalance. For example, nutritional deficiencies. Where is the chicken? Where is the egg? Now, if we put these factors together and create a grid, could we have the first slide, please, Andreas? What we see here is a very simple first representation of these factors. And the first thing that stands out to me is it's very rare that treating only one factor is going to be sufficient. It's very rare that a patient presents themselves with only one of these factors presenting. Now, if we try to treat, say, at the toxic level, try to perhaps prescribe antibiotics for bacterial infection, and we're missing the geopathic stress or the focal stress or any of the other stresses, we're not going to get back to complete health. And so what I've done is simply pair these off. And the next thing that emerges from that is that we have to treat things in the right order. We also need, and I don't want to spend time on the factor here because there isn't time, to consider the nature of the biological terrain, but it does form part of my theme here. And by the biological terrain, I mean the state of fundamental energy balance of the body. And this may be assessed by taking into account the acidity level, the pH factors, the oxidation reduction levels, the RH2 factors, and the electrical resistance of the body fluids. From these three factors, we can gain an indication of proton, electron, and electrolyte balance, and by calculation from that, the redox potential. And the four basic quantities of acidity, oxidation reduction, electrical resistance, and redox potential spell out the basic quantity which governs the nature and rate of energetic action in the body. And since all chemical actions depend on energy bonds, we have a means of assessing the fundamental nature of the terrain which will govern those energy bonds. In passing, it should be noted that specific illnesses can only exist in certain types of terrain. Now, let's stop and consider the nature of the illness, the symptom. The top graph there shows what I think we tend to suspect that happens, that the patient gradually feels unwell. The stress increases and the feeling of well-being decreases, and we tend to see this as a gradual curve. In actual fact, I think the lower graph is probably more accurate. The stress increases to a certain degree and the patient copes with it. He doesn't present himself. he thinks he's okay. And then suddenly there's a kind of quantum leap, and he says, help, I'm ill, I better go and see the doc. And then we've gone up to the top part of the curve. Now, I'm not going to suggest that it's an either-or situation. It's probably a gradual transition. Yes, please. And that we can plot out as the top graph there, various degrees ranging from a gradual transition into illness to a big jump. But I'd like us, if we can, to look at this lower one. Now, at point A on that graph, the stress factor has reached a critical level. The patient now feels distinctly unwell. Point B is where he goes to the doctor and says, I'm unwell. And in this situation, we may have to treat this person until we reach point C. In other words, bring him back along a curve where he gradually feels maybe a bit of improvement, but he doesn't suddenly start to feel well until we drop him down to point D, back onto the lower curve of well-being. To give an example of this, let's take somebody, maybe they work in an office, they've got a boss they can't stand, they get terribly tense, they're sitting there hunched up all day, looking over the shoulder, they get muscular pain. It doesn't come on gradually. It starts building up gradually, but it's at a sudden point they interpret that level of pain as being intolerable and they seek help. Now let's suppose the boss gets fired or he moves on. Theoretically, their stress factor is removed. And in theory, the patient should suddenly say, hey, great, I feel fine again. But he doesn't. He comes back gradually down and then drops into a sense of well-being. Next one, please, Andreas. So we can now create a simple model showing the possible states from a gradual onset of illness through to the latter mentioned situation, a series of curves. Now, that's all very well, but it doesn't suffice. I think we have to move into 3 dimensions to see a fuller model of this. And so I'd like you to imagine, or maybe pick up a piece of paper from the table in front of you, and try to imagine a flexible curve. Fold the paper in front of you. Play with it, like so. And then we'll start getting a 3-dimensional model, which is more appropriate. Okay? The top model there. Please ignore the green scribble on it. Now here, what I've done is plotted the stress factor, or the degree of stress, on the rear axis against the biological terrain. Now, don't ask me what quantities. These are not quantitative deductions, they're qualitative. The vertical axis, labeled, represents the state of well-being. The rear horizontal axis is the stress factor, and the left side axis is the state of the biological terrain. Technically, the right side axis should perhaps slope slightly upwards from the rear towards the front. But it's the surface of this figure in which we are interested, and here we may start to illustrate the different possibilities. It should be noted that the state of well-being is the resultant behavioral change. In this model, we have 2 control variables, the state of the terrain and the degree of stress. Together with the resultant behavioral change, what the patient perceives of his state of well-being. Can you slide it up? And now we can consider some possible states of well-being and see how they relate to the control factors. That'll do. Point A, rear corner. Here we have a situation where the stress factor is low, whatever the stress. Think of all those stresses, the geopathic, the toxic, etc. The stress factor is low and the biological terrain is strong. This is the ideal situation where the patient feels very well. At point B, the biological terrain has deteriorated, but there is little or no stress on the body. In this situation, it's still possible that the patient feels well. Point C on the graph shows a situation where the biological terrain is strong, but the stress factor has increased. Here, the patient may feel out of sorts, but he doesn't define himself yet as being unwell. Sorry, that's point C. Sorry. A, that should be B. C. And then if we jump up onto the upper surface, this is where the... Oh, fine. This is where the patient starts feeling relatively unwell. Now, it's a little bit awkward. I've been told not to move around too much. But here we have a deteriorating biological terrain, but no stress. Patient feels well. As the biological terrain decreases and gets worse, and at the same time the stress factor increases, the patient comes to a point where he's out of sorts, but he's still not presenting. And then suddenly we get the quantum leap up to here on this plane, where the patient is suddenly unwell. And the problem is, when we come to treat that patient, we can't suddenly bring them back to health. We've either got to take it a long way round and decrease the stress factors and improve the biological terrain and bring them back to health, or we've got to bring them back to the edge of this cusp and drop them back over that surface, where our treatment gradually gets them better, but we have to wait. And this is where I think the time factor in treatment comes in. Do we always wait for the patient to get well? Or are we so persistent on trying to do more and more because we're at heart a little bit lacking in confidence with what we've done? I think I'll stop and give a little anecdote, and I hope I'll be forgiven for this, but time factors. Reminds me of the story of the young man who was waiting for his first child. His wife was in the labour ward, and suddenly the nurse rushes in and she says, "Congratulations, you're the father of a lovely daughter." Now, it was 11:15 exactly. And the man says, "My goodness, isn't nature wonderful? That's exactly to the minute since my honeymoon." Quarter of an hour later, the nurse comes back again and she says, "You've got a second one here." And he says, "My goodness, that times with my honeymoon exactly." And at that point, he puts his coat on and he's off out. And the nurse says, "Hey, where are you going? You've got a third one due, why don't you wait?" And he looks at his watch and he says, "That's not due for another hour yet." We have to wait for time. Now, I've shown on the previous diagram the effects of what we call a catastrophe cusp, and I've only considered on that previous diagram a single catastrophe cusp. We've also got to consider bias factors. Now, when we get a neutral bias, as illustrated in the top diagram, we've got roughly equal factors operating. There are roughly equal areas on either side of the cusp. Now, what I've done here is simply projected down onto a flat sheet what the curve in the fold in the piece of paper would look like. Now, the thing is that we can get positive and negative biases. In the negative bias, the left-hand example down there, this is what we might define as the genetically weak patient, or the patient who's prone to illness. His biological terrain is weak, and consequently, a relatively small degree of stress will make him feel ill very quickly. We also get the other extreme, the positive bias. This is the patient with a naturally very good biological terrain who can take a lot more stress. Now ask yourselves, for example, in an influenza epidemic, we say it's an epidemic, and yet probably less than 30% of the patients go down with flu. What keeps other people healthy? We have a bias factor in the catastrophe cusp. And when we stop and think of our health model and we put all these factors together, we should end up with a fold, not one fold in our sheet of paper, but several folds. And they're not static, they're vibrating, they're moving position all the time. And that, in essence, is what I see as our diagnostic problem. Where do we get in to this complexity? It's shifting, it's changing, and if we take it in the wrong order, if you put two folds in the sheet of paper, imagine one surface there, it brings you down to a lower surface and then down to the health surface. If you start treating the symptoms that manifest on the second surface and miss the top one out, you're not hitting the illness at all. Now, I've summarized all that, and I've got a printout of that part of my talk if anyone wants it. I'd like to move on because time's fallen on the floor. Time is pushing to the second aspect, or the second question I asked myself, and this was the role, okay, so I can build up a model of some sort which makes sense to me. And to be totally honest with you, I don't much care if it makes sense to you, and I don't say that in a rude way. It makes sense to me, so I can operate with confidence within my model. It's subjective. But then I asked the question, what are my treatment methods doing? And I took one of the modalities which I use, homeopathy, and decided to ask some simple questions. Now, as I've already said, I'm not a scientist. I'm not backed up by laboratories and a lot of fancy equipment. I'm not backed up by nurses and technical assistants. In fact, if I want anything done, there's only one devil who does it, yours truly. So I sat down and I looked at what is happening in homeopathy, or at least what I think is happening. Now, some of the remarks acknowledge my indebtedness to Paul Callanan of Australia, who put together a wonderful article which was published in Great Britain, which really summarized the some state of knowledge, and I've really adapted some of his work for simplicity. But as a starting mechanism, let's look at a number of the homeopathic laws. We have the law of similars. And the law of similars says any substance which in a crude form or a strong form will give us a set of symptoms. And if we continue to dilute that substance, those symptoms will gradually reduce until it doesn't appear to do much at all. So we think. We also get the law of the minimum dose, which says the amount of medicament required to produce an effect is critical. Now, this is in homeopathy. I would ask you to stop and ask yourselves, does that apply in homeopathy? In allopathy? When you prescribe a regular drug, do you simply look up in the manufacturer's handbook and say, it says here 2 tablets 3 times a day, so that's what I'll give? Or do you actually check out with your patient what his body requires in precise amounts? And we have the direction of cure, Herring's law, which maybe I'll come back to later. But let's start with the second axiom in homeopathy, which is the pharmacological dose-response curve. I want to compare this amount of medicament required is critical. Now, if we look at the dose-response curve, the preferred dose is marked there on the curve as ED50, the estimated dose at... It's the dose which gives 50% of the total or maximal effect. The homeopathic dose is much less than this, lying in the region of the threshold dose, and it's common pharmacological experience that certain amounts of a drug, in other words, the threshold, must be given before any effect becomes apparent. Now, just stop and think, this is common sense. If you don't give enough of it, nothing's going to happen. So we've got to start somewhere. And we continue giving our test subject, whether it be a rat or something in a petri dish, more and more of this until we kill it off. And then we've got the maximal dose, and somewhere between the two extremes is a therapeutic dose. That puts it simply anyway. And the assumption is that a lower dose of a drug produces a decreased effect, and this is based on the monotonicity rule. And the monotonicity rule states that within toxic limits, an increased dose of a drug gives an increased effect, and a lower dose gives less effect. The origin of this rule is unknown. It remains unproven, especially for low toxicity substances, but it's implicitly assumed. Now, one of the starting points in homeopathy is the Arndt-Scholt law, which says that for every drug, small doses stimulate, moderate doses inhibit, and large doses kill off. And while this law has largely been forgotten and is not referred to in the texts, every now and then research findings come up which publish substantiated arguments for that observation. Sorry, these are just some of the research findings which suggest the differences between low concentrations and high concentrations. Now, Pelican and Unger in 1971 examined the effects of silver nitrate in a range of potencies on a growth of wheat seedlings. The trials were repeated with good experimental design and analysis of results, and it was demonstrated that a reproducible growth curve occurred. Now, time is pressing, so I'm going to skip on a little bit here, and let's get down to the meat of the matter. What's happening? Does anything in fact happen? And my own experiments were very simple. I decided to take some samples of water and do the simplest of all measurements to monitor the pH of the water samples, the oxidation reduction levels, and the electrical resistance of water. And there I've learnt my first level. It's remarkably difficult to establish the pH of water. It changes over time. You stick the water in a beaker and put it on the shelf. You take your first sample and measure it, and then wait half an hour and measure it again, and it's not the same pH. Oxidation's occurring, or something's changing. So I had to take a number of samples and try and get a base level of pH. In the first experiment I did, I made up a saturated solution of sodium chloride, measured the pH, RH, and resistance factors, and compared whether there was any difference whether I simply stirred the dilution up or whether I succussed it. And I went through potencies 1 to 6 according to strict homeopathic procedure. Now, the reason I was interested in this is that many of the allergists say that a serial dilution is as effective as a succussed substance, and there's been a lot of argument whether succussion plays any part. Now, the blue line there is the mixed dilutions. The red line is what happens with succussion and changes in pH at different dilutions. There seems to be a substantial difference in the pH values. Could we have the next one, please, Andreas? The RH2 values. Now, I should perhaps stop and explain, in case anyone's unfamiliar, pH is perhaps a measure of the hydrogen ions present and hence the number of protons present. The oxidation reduction factor is possibly a measure of electron availability, free electrons. The electron availability seems to be very much more variable. And the third one, the resistance factors show parallel changes. But the thing to observe is in each case there are greater changes when we succuss rather than when we merely dilute. So I thought, ho, that's interesting. What's going on? So stage 2 was to take an instrument which is claimed to simulate or copy these remedies. And the instrument I used was a German one called the Mora device. And I have conducted a whole series of experiments, and because of time, I'm not going to be able to go through them all. If anyone wants to see the graphs or the statistical analysis, you're very welcome. But the conclusion is that my own deductions are that water, in fact, changes its structure. Now, the classical models of water in ice are a lattice structure of water, and in water as a liquid, we've had varying models, cluster structures, chain structures, and so on proposed. whatever the actual structure of water in its liquid state, when we subject it to low-level information signals, those structures appear to change because we do get significant changes in all factors, pH, RH2, and resistance. Now, the notable thing is that in these examples, I'm not using any chemical input. I'm not even using a measurable electrical input. It's immeasurable. And yet we're getting changes in these factors. Now, that can only suggest to me that water polymers are being formed and the actual molecular structure of the water is being changed. And the deduction I would make is that we're getting electron density shells form, a new form of hydrogen bonding, and the probable structure, and I'm speculating here, is some form of helical structure in 3 dimensions, some sort of helix structure within the water. And as I'm sure Professor Cyril Smith will mention in his talk later, this would suggest that the water has a capacity to resonate and store information within its liquid memory. Now, if that is the case, what are the implications for the amount of water in the body? We are 85% water. Nature doesn't do things by accident. It's there for a purpose. And I'd simply throw to you the question, is the water in the body an information storage media to act as an intermediary? It governs the rate of enzyme reaction. Enzyme reactions depend very, very much on the hydration shell around the enzymes. But I would pose the question further, does the water act as an intermediary storage medium for information to the DNA? And does the DNA helix really hinge round not on its molecular structure, but on the information wavelength, that's stored within the DNA? In other words, is the information level within the DNA helix the guidance of the actual molecular and protein structure and the bondings of the DNA itself? Now, I'm sorry I've had to rush the last few minutes. I suppose really I'd got 2 separate talks here. But coming back to where I started, my starting point was to question what I was doing. I've now made some models which satisfy me to an extent. I'd ask you to go away and forget them because they're not truth, they're not reality, there's no more than a subjective interpretation of reality. But I would like to wind up with a plea here. We're going to hear some wonderful explanations, we're going to hear some very, very good research. It's very valid research. But ask yourself, what is your dream, your personal dream with reference to your work? Not long ago, there's some crazy guys here in the States who said, we want to fly, and science said, you can't fly. Anything heavier than air can't be airborne. Yet somehow I got here through the air. When I was a child, I read of stories of men on the moon and space travel. It was called fiction, science fiction. It's now history. Progress is made not through orthodox knowledge. Progress is made ultimately through the dreamers who hold that ideal of where they want to get to. Then they find the means of getting there. Now, at this Congress, we've got about 500 of us here, each with ideals and goals and dreams. Let's put that dynamic to work between us, find out what those dreams are, and for God's sake, let's work to a planet which is free of disease and which we can truly term a healthy planet. Thank you.